The invitation arrived on university letterhead, embossed and formal. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veteran Middle East correspondent for the BBC, had been asked to deliver the keynote address at Cambridge's annual International Relations Symposium. The topic assigned to her seemed straightforward: Israel's role in regional stability. She had covered the region for 2 decades, interviewed prime ministers and generals, witnessed wars and peace processes. This should have been routine. But as she sat in her London flat, reviewing her notes, something nagged at her. Every narrative she had crafted, every analysis she had delivered, seemed to follow the same predictable patterns. Israel as the regional superpower, Israel as the besieged democracy, Israel as America's strategic asset, Israel as the Middle East's only functioning Western-style state. The stories were clean, digestible, and entirely satisfying to her audiences. Yet recently, during a quiet dinner with an Israeli academic visiting London, something he said had stopped her cold. "You know," he had remarked over wine, "what's fascinating about Western coverage of Israel is how it consistently misses what Israel actually is. You see us as you want to see us, or as you fear to see us, but rarely as we actually see ourselves." That comment haunted her preparation, because the more she examined the standard Western narrative about Israel, the more she realized it might be fundamentally wrong. Not wrong about facts or events, but wrong about the deeper structural reality of what Israel represents and why the Western response to it is so emotionally charged, so contradictory, and so revealing of the West's own anxieties. The conventional wisdom casts Israel in familiar Western categories. It is either the plucky democracy defending itself against hostile neighbors, or the aggressive colonial project oppressing Palestinians. It is either America's strategic partner containing Iranian influence, or the tail, wagging the American dog through lobby influence. These narratives are politically satisfying because they place Israel within frameworks the West understands: democracy versus authoritarianism, colonialism versus liberation, strategic partnership versus manipulation. But what if all of these frameworks miss the point entirely? What if Israel's true significance lies not in how it fits Western political categories, but in how it shatters them? What if the Western obsession with Israel, the disproportionate attention, the emotional intensity, the inability to discuss it rationally, reveals something profound about the West's own crisis of confidence in its foundational assumptions? This is the uncomfortable possibility that began to emerge as Dr. Mitchell dug deeper into her research. Israel was not behaving like a traditional Western democracy because it was not, in any meaningful sense, a Western state at all. The values it actually operated by, the logic that drove its decisions, the social contract that bound its citizens together, none of these resembled the liberal democratic framework that Western observers insisted on applying to it. The first clue lay in Israel's relationship with security. Western democracies, particularly those that have not faced existential threats for generations, treat security as one policy area among many. It competes with economic growth, social welfare, environmental protection, and civil liberties for attention and resources. Trade-offs are normal and expected. Israel operates from an entirely different premise. Security is not a policy area. It is the foundational requirement that makes all other policies possible. This is not paranoia or militarism in the traditional Western sense. It is something more primal and more rational. It is the operating system of a state that was born from the ashes of systematic extermination and has never had the luxury of assuming its survival was guaranteed. This security-first logic produces decisions that baffle Western observers. Why does Israel sometimes act against its apparent economic interests? Why does it risk relationships with allies over issues that seem negotiable? Why does it refuse to make concessions that Western negotiators consider reasonable? The answer lies in understanding that Israel's decision-making matrix weighs every choice against a single criterion. Does this increase or decrease the probability of Jewish survival in the long term? This is not the calculation of a normal Western state. It is the calculation of a civilization that has internalized the lesson that comfortable periods of tolerance and integration can end without warning. And when they do, survival depends entirely on having the capacity for autonomous defense. This creates what Western analysts consistently misidentify as strategic irrationality. But it is not irrational if you accept the premise that the ultimate stake is not prosperity, international standing, or even temporary peace, but the continuation of Jewish civilization itself. Once you understand this premise, Israeli behavior becomes not just logical, but predictable. The second revelation emerged from examining Israel's internal social structure. Western coverage consistently portrays Israeli society through familiar democratic pluralism models. There are left-wing and right-wing parties, secular and religious citizens, hawks and doves. The assumption is that these divisions operate like political differences in London or Berlin or Washington. But Dr. Mitchell discovered that these apparent political divisions masked a deeper consensus that Western observers rarely recognized. Across the Israeli political spectrum, from the most dovish left to the most hawkish right, there existed an implicit agreement on what she began to call the Survival Compact. This was the unspoken understanding that regardless of political differences, the maintenance of Israel's defensive capability was non-negotiable. This consensus was invisible to Western eyes because Western democracies had not faced existential threats for so long that they had forgotten what such consensus looked like. In Britain or France or America, political opposition means total opposition. If the governing party supports a military intervention, the opposition opposes it. If one side backs a trade agreement, the other side attacks it. This is the luxury of states whose survival is not in question. Israeli political debate, beneath its surface heat, operated within much tighter parameters. Labor and Likud might disagree vehemently about settlements, peace processes, or social policy, but neither questioned the need for military superiority, intelligence dominance, or the maintenance of Israel's nuclear deterrent. These were not political issues, they were civilizational requirements. This consensus produced what Western analysts often described as Israeli extremism, but was actually Israeli realism. When Western partners offered security guarantees, Israelis politely accepted them while building their own capabilities. When international bodies promised to monitor compliance with agreements, Israelis participated while maintaining independent verification systems. When allies counseled restraint in the face of threats, Israelis listened respectfully while preparing for unilateral action. None of this was duplicity. It was the logical behavior of a state that understood that ultimate responsibility for its survival could never be delegated to others, no matter how well-intentioned or powerful those others might be. The third element of Dr. Mitchell's emerging understanding concerned Israel's relationship with time. Western democracies, she realized, operated on electoral cycles and quarterly earnings reports. Their planning horizon rarely extended beyond the next election or the next fiscal year. This short-term focus was both a strength and a weakness. It made Western systems responsive and adaptive, but also prone to short-sightedness and inconsistency. Israel operated on historical time. Its strategic planning was not measured in years, but in decades and generations. The settlement enterprise, the development of military industries, the cultivation of relationships with emerging powers like India and China. These were not responses to immediate political pressures, but investments in long-term positioning for challenges that might not materialize for 20 or 30 years. This long-term thinking was often invisible to Western observers who analyzed Israeli actions through the lens of immediate political calculations. Why was Israel investing so heavily in cyber capabilities in the 1990s when the internet was still a curiosity? Why was it developing relationships with African and Asian countries that had little immediate strategic value? Why was it building advanced manufacturing capabilities in areas where cheap labor elsewhere could produce the same goods more efficiently? The answer was that Israel was not optimizing for current conditions, but preparing for multiple possible futures. In some of those futures, traditional alliances might prove unreliable. In others, new technologies might shift the balance of power. In still others, global trade patterns might change dramatically. Israel's strategy was to maintain capabilities and relationships that would provide options regardless of which future materialized. This approach produced what Western analysts often described as Israeli stubbornness, but was actually strategic patience. Israel would maintain positions that seemed economically or diplomatically costly in the short term because they served long-term survival requirements that were invisible to observers focused on quarterly results. As Dr. Mitchell synthesized these insights, she began to understand why Western engagement with Israel was so consistently frustrating for both sides. The West was trying to apply the logic of prosperous, secure democracies to a state that operated according to the logic of civilizational survival. The categories didn't fit, and the resulting misunderstanding produced the endless cycle of miscommunication and mutual frustration that characterized Israeli-Western relations. But the deeper realization was more uncomfortable. Israel was not an anomaly or an exception to Western democratic norms. It was a preview. It was what Western states might become if they faced serious existential challenges. The security first logic, the civilizational consensus, the long-term strategic thinking. These were not uniquely Jewish or Middle Eastern phenomena. They were the natural responses of any society that could no longer take its survival for granted. This was why Israel generated such intense emotional reactions in Western discourse. It was not really about Israel at all. Israel served as a mirror, reflecting back to Western societies their own deepest fears about what they might have to become. The liberal democratic values that the West celebrated, openness, tolerance, multiculturalism, international cooperation, were all premised on a fundamental assumption of security. But what happened when that assumption no longer held? Israel provided an answer that Western societies found deeply disturbing. It suggested that liberal values were not universal principles, but contextual luxuries that depended on particular historical circumstances. When those circumstances changed, survival might require different values: unity over diversity, self-reliance over cooperation, long-term thinking over short-term optimization. The Western critique of Israel Dr. Mitchell realized, was not primarily about Israeli behavior. It was about Western anxiety. By condemning Israel for prioritizing security over liberal norms, Western societies were reassuring themselves that they would never face such choices, that their commitment to liberal values was absolute and permanent. But this was a dangerous delusion. Western societies were already beginning to face challenges that questioned their fundamental assumptions. Climate change, mass migration, technological disruption, great power competition, all of these trends suggested that the comfortable post-war period of assumed security and prosperity might be ending. The rise of populist movements, the erosion of international institutions, the return of geopolitical competition, these were early indicators that Western societies might soon face the kind of existential choices that Israel had been navigating for decades. Israel's real significance was not as a regional power or a strategic ally or a moral exemplar. It was as a laboratory for how democratic societies adapted when their survival could no longer be taken for granted. The experiments being conducted in that laboratory produced results that Western observers found alarming, but they might also produce lessons that Western societies would need to learn. The uncomfortable truth was that everything the West thought it knew about Israel was wrong, because the West was using the wrong framework for analysis. Israel was not a Western democracy that had gone astray. It was a post-Western democracy that had adapted to post-Western conditions, and those conditions were spreading. Dr. Mitchell closed her laptop and stared out at the London skyline. The speech she would deliver at Cambridge would be very different from the one she had planned to give, because the real story about Israel was not about Israel at all. It was about the future of the West itself, and whether Western societies had the wisdom to learn from the mirror that Israel held up to them, or whether they would shatter that mirror rather than confront what it revealed. The choice, she realized, was not really Israel's to make. It was the West's, and time was running out to make it wisely.